The Life and Teaching of the Masters of the Far East, Volume 1, Chapter 21. Before noon of the next day, all parties had arrived. We spent the afternoon in comparing notes, and these notes checked to the letter. That evening, after we finished with our notes, we were invited to go directly to the lodge for dinner. When we arrived, we found about 300 people, men, women, and children, assembled and seated at long banquet tables. They had reserved places for us at one of the end tables, so we could look down the whole length of the room. The tables were covered with beautiful white linen and set with china and silver plate, as for a real banquet, and yet there was but one dim light burning in the hall. After we had been seated for perhaps 20 minutes, there was a deep stillness, and in a moment a pale light flooded the room. The light grew stronger and stronger until all the room was aglow and everything in the room sparkled as if thousands of incandescent lamps had been cunningly hidden and turned on gradually until all were fully lighted. We were to learn afterwards that there were no electric lights in the village. After the light came on, the stillness lasted for about 15 minutes. Then, all of a sudden, a mist seemed to gather, and there was that same gentle swish, like the sound of wings that we had heard the evening before when Emil's mother appeared before us. The mist cleared, and standing in the room at different points were Emil's mother and 11 others, 9 men and 3 women. Words fail to describe the radiant beauty of that scene. When I say that, although they had no wings, they appeared like a troop of angels, I am not exaggerating. They stood for an instant as if transfixed, all bowed their heads and waited. In a moment, there came music from unseen voices. I had heard of heavenly voices, but I had never experienced them until that night. We were fairly lifted from our seats. Toward the close, those that had appeared walked to their seats, and we again noticed that, though they made no effort to walk quietly, their feet did not make the slightest noise. When the 12 were seated in their respective places, the same mist appeared again, and when it had cleared, there stood 12 more. This time there were 11 men and 1 woman, and among these was our friend of the records. As they stood there for a moment, another song burst forth. When the song was nearly ended, the 12 walked to their respective places without the slightest noise. They were no sooner seated than the haze filled the room again. When it had cleared, there were 13 standing, this time across the far end of the hall, 6 men and 7 women, 3 men and 3 women on each side of the woman in the center. The center one appeared to be a beautiful girl in her teens. We had thought that every woman that appeared was very beautiful, but this one surpassed them all. They stood with bowed heads for a moment, and the music again burst forth. This music floated out for a moment, then the choir of voices began. We arose to our feet. As the tones rolled on, it seemed as though we could see thousands of mystical forms moving about the singing as with one voice, and through it all there was not one sad refrain, not one minor key. All was a joyous, free burst of music that came from the soul and touched the soul, lifting it up and up, until we felt as if we were losing all contact with the earth. As the singing ceased, the 13 walked to their respective places and were seated. Our eyes were fairly glued on the central figure as she advanced toward our table, with a lady on either side. She was seated at the head of our table. As she sat down, the places were quietly stacked at her left hand. The lights grew dim for a moment, and around each one of the 37 there was the same light that so puzzled us, and the most beautiful circle of light just above the head of our honored guest. We were the only ones in that assembly that were greatly moved. Those assembled with us seemed to take it as a matter of course. After all were seated, the silence was maintained for a time. Then every voice in the room burst forth in a glad, free chant led by the 37 that had appeared. When this was finished, the lady at the head of our table arose and held out her hands. On them appeared a loaf of bread about 2 inches square and about 14 inches long. Then each one of the other 36 arose, came forward, and received a similar loaf from her hands. They passed around to all the table and gave to each one portion of the bread. Our lady passed around and gave each one a portion of her loaf. As she handed each of us our portion, she said, "Know ye not that Christ dwells within you and in all? Know ye not that your body is pure, perfect, young, ever beautiful, divine? Know ye not that God created you an exact image and likeness of himself, and gave you dominion over all things? You of yourself are always Christ, the perfect Son of God, the only begotten Son of God, in whom the Father Mother is well pleased. You are pure, perfect, holy, divine, one with God, all good, and each and every child has a right to claim this sonship, this divinity." When all had been given a portion, she returned to her seat, and the loaf was the same length and size as it was when she broke the first portion from it. After the ceremony was over, the edibles began to arrive. They came in large covered containers. These containers just appeared on the table before the lady as if they were placed there by unseen hands. She lifted the lids, set them aside, and began serving. As served, the plates were passed. First one to the lady on the right, then one to the lady on the left, and they in turn passed them on until all was served generously. The meal had not progressed far when our chief asked the lady what she considered the greatest attribute of God. Without a moment's hesitation, she answered, "Love." Then she went on to say, "The tree of life is located in the midst of the paradise of God, the very depth of our own soul, and the rich, abundant fruit that grows and ripens to the fullest perfection, the most perfect and life-giving, is love. Love has been defined by those who perceive its true character as the greatest thing in the world. I might add that it is the greatest thing in the world. I might add that it is the greatest healing force in the world. Love never fails to meet every demand of the human heart. The divine principle of love may be used to eliminate every sorrow, every infirmity, every harsh condition, and every lack that harasses humanity. With the right understanding and use of the subtle and illimitable influence of love, the world may be healed of its wounds, and the sweet mantle of its heavenly compassion may cover all inharmony, all ignorance, and all mistakes of mankind. With wings outstretched, love searches out the arid spots of the human heart, the waste places of life, and with seeming magic touch redeems humanity and transforms the world. Love is God, eternal, limitless, changeless, going beyond all visions into infinitude, the end we can only envision. Love fulfills a law of its own, consummates its perfect work, and reveals the Christ within the soul of man. Love is ever seeking an inlet whereby it may flow forth into the soul of man and pour itself out as all good to him. If it is not disturbed by man's perversity and discordant thinking, God's eternal, changeless current of love flows ever onward, carrying before it into the great universal sea of forgetfulness every appearance of inharmony or ugliness which disturbs the peace of man. Love is the perfect fruit of the Spirit. It goes forth, binding up the wounds of humanity, drawing nations into closer harmony, and bringing peace and prosperity to the world. It is the very pulse of the world, the heartbeat of the universe. Humanity must be charged with this current of love from the great omnipresent life if it would do the works of Jesus. Does life press heavily upon you? Do you need courage and strength to meet the problems that confront you? Are you sick or afraid? If so, lift your heart and pray to Him who leads the way. The imperishable love of God enfolds you. You need not fear. Did He not say, "Before they call, I will answer, and while they are yet speaking, I will hear"? Approach this throne of grace boldly, not as you have thought of beseeching and groveling attitude, but with the prayer of understanding faith, knowing that the help you stand in need of is already yours. Never doubt. Do more. Ask. Claim your birthright as the child of the living God, as Jesus did. Know that in the invisible, universal substance, in which we all live and move and have our being, is every good and perfect thing that man can desire, waiting to be drawn forth by faith into the visible form or manifestation. Read in your own great book what Paul says of love in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, using the word love instead of charity, as was intended. Consider Solomon, when in the night of his experience he allowed his radiant love nature to expand to the universal plane of consciousness, where he asked to be of service and not for self. This brought to him wealth untold, and added to this was a life and honor beyond his power to ask. He recognized the wisdom of love, and love released its boundless wealth upon him. Silver was counted as naught in the days of Solomon. Even the drinking vessels of this mighty king of love were of pure gold. To love is to release God's unlimited storehouse of golden treasure. If we love, we cannot help giving. and to give is to gain, and the law of love is fulfilled. Then by giving, we set in operation the unfailing law of measure for measure. With no thought of receiving, it is impossible to avoid receiving, for the abundance you have given is returned to you in fulfillment of the law. Give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, shall men give unto your bosom. For with the same measure that you met withal, it shall be measured to you again. If we work in the spirit of love, we must have God present in consciousness. To be one with life, love, and wisdom is to consciously contact God, is to have abundance pressed upon us the same as abundance of food has been pressed upon us as tonight. You see, there is an abundance for all, and none need want in the presence of God's abundance. This thought of abundance must lift the mind far beyond the bounds of limitation. To conceive abundance, one must relinquish all thoughts of things in particular. This concept is so large that it will not permit the thought of detail. To hold it in mind, consciousness must swing far out into the universal and revel in the joyousness of perfect freedom. This freedom must, however, not be taken for license, for we are held responsible for every thought, every act. Our consciousness cannot attain to this freedom in an instant. The breaking of the last vestige of limitation may be accomplished in an instant, but the preparation for the glorious event has gone before. The preparation, in minutest detail, has been accomplished from within, just as every petal of a flower is perfect in every detail within the bud. When the perfection is complete, the bud bursts its sepal shell, and the flower comes forth beautiful. Just so, man must break the shell of self before he can come forth. God's laws are changeless, the same as they have ever been. While they are immutable, they are beneficent, for they are good. When we live in conformity to them, they become the very foundation stones on which we build our health, our happiness, our peace and poise, our success and attainment. If we abide fully in God's law, no evil can befall us. We do not need to be healed. We are every whit whole. How well we realize that in the great heart of humanity there is a deep homesickness which never can be satisfied with anything less than a clear consciousness or understanding of God, our Father. We recognize this hunger as hearts cry after God. There is nothing the human soul so longs for as to know God, whom to know aright is life eternal. We see people ever shifting from one thing to another, hoping they will find satisfaction or rest in some accomplishment or in the possession of some limited mortal desire. We see them pursuing and gaining these things only to find themselves still unsatisfied. Some fancy they want houses and lands, some great wealth, and some great learning. We are privileged to know that man has all these things within himself. Jesus, the great Master, attempted to have all see this. How we do love him! He stands out so beautifully triumphant, because of his attainments. We love all who have reached the heights or high places in consciousness that Jesus has. We not only love them for their attainments, but because of what they really are. Jesus never allowed himself to dwell in the external after his illumination. He always kept his thoughts at the central part of his being, which is the Christ. In Jesus, the Christ, or central spark, which is God in us all, living in everyone today, was drawn forth to show itself perfectly ruling the material body, or flesh man. It is in this way that he did all his mighty works, not because he was in some way different from you. He had no greater power than all have today. He was not in some way a son of God, and we only servants of God. He did these works because the same divine spark which the Father has implanted in every child born was fanned into a brighter flame by his own efforts in holding himself in conscious communion with God himself, the source of all life, love, and power. Jesus was a man the same as all men are today. He suffered, was tempted and tried, just as you suffer because of temptations and trials. We know that during his residence on earth in the visible body, Jesus spent hours of every day alone with God. And we know that in his early manhood, he went through just what we have gone through and what you are going through today. We know that every man must overcome the mortal, the fleshly desires, the doubts and fears, until he comes to the perfect consciousness or recognition of the indwelling presence, this Father in me, to whom Jesus ascribed the credit of all his mighty works. He had to learn